quorum is present. The joint hearing of the House Committee on Education and Labor Subcommittees on Healthy Families and Communities and the House Committee on Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, Homeland Security, on Lost Education Opportunities in Alternative Settings will come to order. Before we begin, I would like to ask everybody to take a moment to ensure that your cell phones and Blackberries are on silent. Something just beeped over there. I now recognize myself, followed by Chairman Bobby Scott of the House Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security. After Mr. Scott, the Subcommittee on Healthy Families and Communities Ranking Member Todd Platts from Pennsylvania will be recognized for an opening statement, followed by the Congressman from Texas, the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, Homeland Security, and Ranking Member Gourmet. Thank you for all being here. I would like to thank you all for being here today, and I thank you for traveling and spending the time with us. I think it's very important. The testimony that we heard, or I should say read, is very interesting, and it was meeting with my national PTA people upstairs before I came down here, and one of the things that was on their agenda was that a lot of young people were going into the juvenile justice system, even just for truancy. And that's something I know that we're going to be discussing here. Each of us sitting here knows that the importance of education in a child's life. Unfortunately, there is a whole population of students not receiving adequate education services, and there is no or little to no accountability. This hearing will focus on youth who, in many instances, need the most help, but all too often fall through the cracks. For them, the opportunity for a decent education is lost. The students we are talking about may be in day treatment programs, residential treatment centers, group homes, foster care settings, juvenile justice facilities, or private therapeutic programs. Data reflects that minority youth, low-income youth, and youth with disabilities are overrepresented in these particular systems. Youth are commonly shuffled from one setting to the next, with education services varying in each placement locality and state. A 2007 report by the Government Accountability Office on Residential Facilities found state governments that are responsible for the oversight of juvenile facilities often do not monitor the quality of the education programs in these facilities or monitor them inconsistently. The consequences for the students include a lack of qualified teachers, shortened school days, low quality of curriculum, and overall lost opportunities. In fact, data shows that only 17% of teachers in juvenile facilities are fully certified. We hear stories of teenage students being given coloring sheets as their schoolwork. Teachers are not showing up to teach class, and lockdown situations that leave children without any form of education for days at a time. One of our witnesses, Dr. Bloomberg, will touch on the school-to-prison pipeline, where students begin in a traditional public school and are referred to alternative placements, many times for minor infractions like truancy. Another witness, Miss Steele, will talk about growing up with undiagnosed learning disabilities, dropping out of school, and fighting her way back to become an attorney who protects the education rights of vulnerable at-risk youth, including those in foster care and those with learning disabilities. I understand Ms. Steele's situation, as I was diagnosed with dyslexia at the age 30. These students then receive substandard education and ultimately end the cycle from within a juvenile justice facility or incarcerated. It is not realistic to expect students receiving this type of education to graduate high school or let alone go to college. We know a good education is one of the most effective ways to prevent delinquency. The overall economic costs for individuals in the corrective system are astonishing. To address the educational needs of students from the beginning of a child's school career before that child falls through the cracks is not only economically sound, but is simply the right thing to do. Though each of our witnesses here today can speak to successes despite the odds, success for these vulnerable youth is not the norm. Thank you all for joining us on this testimony, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. I now recognize the distinguished chairman of the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security, who is also a member of this committee, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman McCarthy. I'm pleased to join you in welcoming members, witnesses, and guests to today's joint hearing entitled Lost Educational Opportunities in Alternative Settings before the Committee on Education and Labor's Subcommittee on Health, Families, and Communities and the Subcommittee on Judiciary, Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security, which I chair. I believe this is a timely hearing on a timely subject of ensuring that all children receive a world-class education that will allow them to compete for jobs and prosperity in a rapidly changing and challenging world economy. It's, I think, interesting to note that it's an Education and Judiciary Committee joint hearing because, Madam Chairwoman, if we don't get it right in your subcommittee, I'm going to have to deal with it in my subcommittee. So I'm particularly pleased to welcome one of our expert witnesses today, Dr. Cynthia Cave, who is Director of the Office of Student Services at the Virginia Department of Education, whom I had the pleasure to work with when I was in the General Assembly, and I'll be introducing a bit later. Today's hearing will examine the challenges associated with educating children in an alternative setting and how to overcome obstacles in providing quality education in these settings. For many reasons, children in this country are educated with public funds in settings other than traditional public schools. Generally, alternative settings, such as alternative schools, juvenile detention facilities, and foster care settings, were established with the objective of addressing children's individualized needs while educating them so that they can eventually move back to the public school system. Not providing an educational setting to children when they've been suspended or expelled from their home is not only counterproductive, but morally wrong. Society pays a much higher cost, financially and otherwise, if we don't provide an educational alternative than if we do. Given the importance of a solid education in achieving a successful life, we must make sure that the quality of education that young people receive in alternative settings is sufficient for them to continue on to vocational training or college, just as any other student. Some alternative settings have created positive therapeutic environments for young people that have proved to be very successful, and we need to learn from these models. Unfortunately, it is clear that not all children who are educated in alternative schools are being provided with the educational opportunities, with the good educational opportunities that they need to become successful in life. Families and educators alike are concerned that instead of addressing the individualized needs of students, some alternative schools are pushing students out of school and into the streets and eventually into the juvenile and criminal justice system. The school system has become a gateway to the juvenile justice system through disciplinary policies such as zero tolerance that require school suspension, expulsion, and arrest for an increasing number of common student behaviors and rule violations. National Center for Educational Statistics found that 31% of students who have been suspended 3 or more times before the 10th grade drop out of school, compared to only 6% of those who have never been suspended. The high and growing percentage of youth who are suspended or expelled from school are youth of color. African American, Latino, Asian, and Native Americans are 58% of students suspended or expelled from school. Indeed, many children of color start on a trajectory of school failure, suspension, expulsion, and then to prison. They start on that trajectory at birth. The Sentencing Project estimates that 1 out of every 3 black male students born today can expect to go to prison in their lifetime if the current trends continue. This development has led the Children's Defense Fund to conclude that many black children are born on what they call the cradle-to-prison pipeline. We have to change that trajectory and put these children on a cradle-to-college or cradle-to-the-workforce pipeline, because it's not only tragic, but also much more costly to our society in the long run if we don't. The Department of Justice and other estimates show that we spend an average of over $23,000 per inmate per year to incarcerate, while it only costs $8,000 a year to educate them. The Alliance for Excellence in Education projects that if the male graduation rate is increased by only 5%, the nation would see an annual savings of almost $5 billion in reduction in crime-related costs. A report by the American Youth Policy Forum indicates that dropouts are 3.5 times more likely than high school graduates to be incarcerated during their lifetime, so we know that education is key to keeping our children away from the prison cell and getting them back on the right track towards a college dorm room or the workforce. An issue of quality education in an alternative setting is especially important with the new accountability under No Child Left Behind, as well as mandates for students who are under the Individuals with Disabilities Act. All students must have a challenging curriculum that we will prepare them to pass state standardized tests and to graduate them from high school. Other challenging educational settings and educating children, another educational setting with educating children is foster care. These children have many obstacles into getting a quality education as youth in the juvenile justice system. Young people in foster care often experience numerous changes in their home placements that require them to change schools frequently. Foster care children have to adjust to new teachers, classmates, curricula, and rules in every new home placement, and as a result, children often end up losing academic credits, experiencing delays in student record transfers, delayed enrollment, and reporting of grades. So we must be concerned about foster care students, regardless of whether they are in the traditional or alternative educational placements due to these challenges. I look forward to listening to the testimony from today's witnesses and hearing more about how we can assist school systems in successfully overcoming the challenges in providing quality education to children in alternative settings and to foster care students particularly in all settings. And thank you, Madam Chairman, for holding this hearing.
And I thank you, Mr. Scott. Now may I introduce my ranking member, Mr. Todd from Pennsylvania, who has been a good colleague the last several years, working very well together.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank you very much for holding this very important hearing on our alternative education systems, and really so we can learn from our expert witnesses on the strengths and weaknesses of our systems throughout the country. I am very pleased that we have been joined by our colleagues on the Judiciary Subcommittee and Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Gomer, delighted to join you as well as the other members of both subcommittees. I'm going to submit my my statement for the record. Both Chairwoman McCarthy, you and Chairman Scott both presented very thoughtful statements, I think captured the importance of this issue and why we're here today. I am especially pleased to thank each of our witnesses. Your expertise out on the front lines of this issue is what this hearing is all about, because through your knowledge that you share with us, we can be better informed as policymakers, and as Chairman Scott said, hopefully get it right on the alternative education side, so that we're not dealing with issues on his subcommittee side, which is the criminal side. And we're grateful for not just your presence here today, but I know the effort that goes into being part of a hearing and preparing your testimony. I'm sure it took some great effort and sacrifice in the past week, and we're grateful for that effort and look forward to your testimony and your wisdom being shared with us. So thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Platts. Now I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Gomot, who is also on the House Terrorism Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Gomot.
Okay, thank you, Chairwoman McCarthy, Ranking Member Platts, Chairman Scott. It's a pleasure to be with each of you and to have the witnesses here today. Look forward to hearing from you. Administering justice to juvenile offenders has largely been the domain of states, as you know. There is no federal juvenile justice system. In fact, when the federal government adjudicates a juvenile as a delinquent, that individual is housed in either private or state-run facilities because the Bureau of Prisons does not operate residential placement facilities for juveniles. But when looking at the state systems, it's difficult to make an accurate count of the number of juveniles that are committed at any one time, because juveniles transition in and out of the system frequently. One metric is the Census of Juveniles in Residential Placement, or CJRP, which provides an annual one-day snapshot count of all juvenile offenders in public or private residential facilities in the United States. A review of recent CJRP data indicates that the number of juveniles in state, local, and private correctional facilities has actually declined since 1999. The data shows that juvenile offenders in custody fell about 14% from nearly 109,000 offenders in 1999 to almost 93,000 in 2006, the last year for which we have such data. Many of these juveniles are only in the correctional facilities for short periods. According to the CJRP, A closer look at the juveniles committed as part of a court order disposition indicated 80% have been in the facility at least 30 days, 68% for less than 60 days, and 57% for at least 90 days. Only 12% of the committed offenders remained in the placement for over a year. Creating and maintaining educational programs for juveniles that are often coming and going from facilities is quite challenging, of course. However, many states have made valiant efforts to provide the best possible programming that they can. In 2004, an article that tracked the history of juvenile correction education programs nationwide was published in the Journal of Correctional Education. The article found that, quote, since 1997, a number of states have taken the lead in demonstrating the quality of their juvenile correctional education programs by responding to the education standards movement, unquote. The article concluded that a number of states, including Georgia, Alabama, and Ohio, improved their programs by aligning the juvenile correctional education programs with their state education standards. These states should be recognized for their efforts, and other states should look to these policies to see if it makes sense to adopt them. However, we should remain mindful of the fact that state and local juvenile justice facilities face systemic hurdles that are often beyond their control. A 2004 study of the juvenile justice system by the University of Maryland concluded that most youths enter correctional facilities with a range of intense educational, mental health, medical, and social needs. A large number of juveniles in corrections are marginally literate and have experienced school failure and retention at the public school level. My own experience with minors in the criminal and juvenile justice system reflects these sad realities. Before I was elected to Congress, I served as a district judge and as Chief Justice of Intermediate Court of Appeals. I also served on the County Juvenile Board. During my tenure on the bench, I sometimes oversaw cases involving juveniles facing charges so serious that they were prosecuted as adults. Time and time again, you had to wonder where these kids came from and how they got here. Often the answer was that these kids came from broken homes with two parents or without two parents and other positive role models. I also often discovered these kids had very poor levels of education, and most were high school dropouts by their own choice. As a judge, I took note for a 3-month period of exactly how many I was sentencing day in, day out, who had never had a relationship with their father, and it was over 80%. Educational opportunities for juveniles in alternative settings is a small facet of a larger problem. State issues that affect the nation include the breakdown of the family. Another state issue affecting the nation is the failure of the public schools. Another problem is a culture where uneducated, illiterate, foul-talking tough guys end up being role models. We will not find solutions in only examining the symptoms. Again, one of the diseases may be the breakdown of the American home and family. But hopefully states will find information we glean from these hearings helpful and will appreciate this inquiry, with this issue, of course, being reserved to the states by the 10th Amendment. It does seem that with each decade for the last 50 years in which the federal government has usurped more of the state control of education, we have had greater and greater problems in the educational prominence of our students. So I appreciate the witnesses being here. I think it's helpful for where we have the resources to make these inquiries and help give states guidance. But one final anecdotal indication, in our juvenile justice facility, we kept getting restriction after restriction on how we could, what we had to do to feed the juveniles in order to get the $1 of federal subsidy. After more and more restrictions were put on, more and more requirements, we finally had the director figure out what it would cost, number one, to do an inquiry with our juveniles, find out what they like to eat better than what they were eating, and how we could have it even more nutritional. We provided more nutritional meal, and it was meals they chose. We gave up the $1 of federal subsidy, and we saved ourselves $2 a meal. Thank you. I yield back.
And with that, I thank the gentleman. I'd also like to say that Mr. Buck McCain, the ranking member on the full committee, was here with us. I thank him. I guess he left. Pursuant to Committee Rule 12A, any member may submit an opening statement in writing at this time, which will be made part of the permanent record. Without objection, all members will have 14 days to submit additional materials or questions for the hearing record. Let me just explain the lighting system. You have 5 minutes each, you'll have a green light when you start. There's a yellow light saying that you're getting down to about 4 minutes, and obviously when your red light goes on, I'm not going to stop you in the mid-sentence or mid-thought, but it'd be time to wrap up, and so this way everybody can have a full opportunity to ask their questions. Our first witness, Dr. Thomas Bloomberg, is the Dean and Professor of Criminology in the College of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Florida State University and the editor of Criminology and Public Policy. Dr. Bloomberg's research in Florida and throughout the nation is internationally recognized. He will also touch on the practices and effectiveness of alternative education, schools for at-risk youth, and developed educational and behavior qualities assurance standards for these schools. And welcome, Mr. Bloomberg. Our next witness is Mr. Leon Dixon. Currently, Mr. Dixon works for the Wayne County Juvenile Detention Facility, Department of Children and Family Services in Detroit as the executive director. With more than 29 years of juvenile justice experience, Mr. Dixon will give light to a holistic approach in serving youth in correctional and detention facilities and is recognized nationally and internationally on this topic. Welcome, Mr. Dixon. Sharing both her personal perspective and her expertise as an attorney advocate is Ms. Jean Steele. As a former high school dropout with a learning disability who went down the path of addiction and homelessness, once her learning needs were finally diagnosed as an adult, she was able to go to law school with the intention of representing at-risk youth and ensuring quality education. Ms. Steele founded the Learning Rights Law Center in Los Angeles, an educational-based legal advocacy organization which works to prevent the systematic placement of foster youth in restrictive and what Steele calls substandard educational environments. I now yield to Congressman Scott to introduce the next witness, Dr. Cynthia Cave.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Cynthia Cave, Director of Student Services in the Division of Special Services, Special Education and Student Services at the Virginia Department of Education. She's been part of the Department of Education for over 11 years. Prior to coming to the Department of Education, she was Assistant Commissioner for Field Services for the Department of Rehabilitative Services and Deputy Commissioner for Administration for the Department of Health. Before joining the state, she worked in various positions in local government, including Executive Director in Intergovernmental Relations for the City of Santa Ana, California. She has also served as the adjunct professor for the doctoral program for the School of Education and master's program for the Department of Public Administration at Virginia Commonwealth University. She holds a PhD in public administration from Syracuse at the Maxwell School, a master's of public administration from the University of Maine, and a Bachelor of Science from the College of William and Mary. And I'm particularly pleased to see her because we did work together when I was in the Virginia General Assembly, so it's good to see you.
Thank you, Bobby. Next, we'll yield to my ranking member, Congressman Platts, to introduce our next witness, Dr. Whitemore.
Okay, thank you, Chairwoman McCarthy. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Robert Whitmore here as a witness. Dr. Whitmore has 36 years of professional experience working with at-risk youth in a variety of community settings. Dr. Whitmore is a co-founder and CEO of Manitou Incorporated, a private nonprofit organization based in Pennsylvania. And for 30 years, he has guided Manitou in the development and delivery of comprehensive alternative education, juvenile justice, and behavior health services to children, adolescents, and their families. And I think important as he, I think will reference in his remarks, he began his career as a juvenile probation officer and has an important perspective that he brings to the table today. Manitou currently provides a number of comprehensive educational and behavioral health services in 11 counties in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and serves over 700 children on a daily basis. I'm proud to say that Manitou operates 8 programs in my congressional district and does so very well. Dr. Whitmore has focused his efforts on the development of services to at-risk youth who have been unsuccessful in traditional public school and community settings, with an emphasis on creating supportive services to keep children in their families and communities. And Dr. Whitmore, again, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Todd. And next, our Congressman Garma to introduce the next witness, Lynn Brooke.
Okay. Thank you. And we do appreciate the witnesses. I know some of you probably came just because of how much money you get paid for being a witness here. But, yeah, I mean, y'all know, there may be people listening that don't know. You don't get paid for coming. We don't, I think it's a bipartisan shortcoming. We don't even pay airfare to get people up here. And maybe someday we can do something on a bipartisan basis to fix that. But it makes us all the more grateful that anybody's willing to come up here and talk to us. But Linda Brooke, so glad to have her here. She's the Director of Government Relations and Education Services for the Texas Juvenile Probation Commission. The TJPC is the state agency that establishes standards and provides funds, training, and technical assistance for the 168 juvenile probation departments of Texas. Ms. Brooke began her career in juvenile justice working in Montgomery County, Texas, where she has worked as a detention officer, probation officer, and later as a supervisor in the Administrative Service Division. The last 16 years of her career have been with the Texas Juvenile Probation Commission, where she has worked as a field services resource specialist and later as the Director of Government Relations and Educational Services. Ms. Brooke was instrumental in the development of the juvenile justice education programs in the state and serves as a state resource for local juvenile probation departments, school districts, juvenile boards, and the state legislature, including coming and helping my county of Smith and probably Judge Poe's county or counties as well. But Ms. Brooke has she has provided numerous trainings on juvenile justice education issues to groups and organizations such as the Juvenile Justice Association of Texas, Texas Probation Association, Safe Drug and Drug-Free Communities, Texas Juvenile Post-Legislative Conference. In addition, she testifies frequently in front of Texas legislative committees on juvenile justice-related matters and frequently is consulted on drafting legislation. She graduated from Sam Houston State University in criminology and corrections, and pleased to have her here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And before we start with our first witness, when each of you speak, just make sure that you pull your microphone up close to you and push the button so that we can all hear you. Dr. Bloomberg, if you would begin.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to kind of cover, just try to summarize what I provided in my written outline, which deals with the problem of lost educational opportunities, what I feel are the opportunities with these students, and then the benefits. Earlier it was mentioned that our public schools are failing these students. I think that it's a little unrealistic for us to imagine that our public schools that service approximately 50 million students annually, of which roughly 14% or well over 6 million are diagnosed with learning and behavior difficulties. It's sort of hard to imagine that they could really be satisfactorily serving all of those students, and that's where alternative education settings come in, and that's of course what I'll try to focus on. Now, last year, these alternative schools and juvenile justice facilities, and I was very glad to hear the acknowledgement that we don't even have good data on how many students, for example, are in juvenile justice schools. I have worked with that over a number of years, and that's certainly something we need to improve. But last year, approximately 1 million youth were in alternative schools or in juvenile justice schools. And these programs are woefully inadequate. There's differences among these schools. Some are better than others. But again, I think we've had a historical pattern, which has been that this population has generally been viewed as disposable. That's been the history. Even with the development of the juvenile court at the turn of the 20th century, we had rhetoric that called for education, but the reality, as all of you know, was those teachers that found themselves in these alternative settings tended to be those often who couldn't make it in the public school setting. So we have had this problem. And so what results from all of this? Well, many of these 1 million or more students fall through the cracks. And they do become disproportionately involved in crime, in chemical abuse, or unemployment. And it's estimated that for each youth that does fall into this pattern, that's going to cost this country $2.2 million. $2.2 million. But the opportunity that I've seen in my last 11 years in Florida is primarily what I'm here to tell you about. Florida had the Bobby M. consent decree, and in the early 90s established a very strong quality assurance and research system for its juvenile justice schools, and I've been a part of that for 11 years, and it's been one of the most amazing projects that I've ever been involved with in my entire 36 academic and research career. The children in Florida's juvenile justice schools, there's approximately 200 schools. On any given day, 10,000 youth are incarcerated in those schools. These kids are anywhere from 3 to 6 years behind in their age grade placement. Chronic histories of suspension, expulsion, and dropout. Disproportionately, roughly 50% or more are formally designated with learning or behavior difficulties, compared to about 10 to 12% in Florida's public schools. So clearly a very high-risk population to deal with. But nonetheless, what we've done since 1998, we've developed standards, education standards for these schools. We've gone in annually. We've assessed those standards to make sure that the programs are fulfilling what it is they're supposed to be fulfilling. But it's not merely a gotcha. We also stop, take a breath, and then meet with the teachers, meet with the principals, meet with the custodial staff, and say, here are the steps that are needed to improve these schools. So it brings in kind of a moral authority involved in what we're doing, because the teachers really care, and many of the teachers really thank us for what we're doing for them. Furthermore, each year we pull all the key actors together throughout the state of Florida, and we assess where we are in juvenile justice ed. And each year we continuously raise the bar. We require more, not less, because this population needs more, not less. We have 2 major longitudinal cohorts of 4,000 and 6,000 kids. Some of these kids have been out 6 years. Those kids that academically achieve disproportionately return to school. And if they return to school, their likelihood of rearrest drops precipitously. This is something that works in changing the life course of these children. This program can work. Now, in terms of the benefits are numerous. Crime is estimated to cost this country $1 trillion a year. Yes, $1 trillion. That's just more money than I can imagine. And what I've done in the handout, I've provided you some cost estimates if you look at the benefits that can be accrued with different proportions of these 1 million kids changing their life course. That's also in the billions of dollars. But the bottom line is you can't simply mandate these 3 best practices that you've all heard before: qualified teachers, individualized curriculum, and transition. These are the 3 best practices areas, but again, that is something that's going to have to be evaluated, and I see I've already overdone my time. Sorry.
Not bad. Our next witness, Ms. Brooke, and thank you for being here.
Okay, now I believe I'm on. Okay. I'm here today to talk about juvenile justice alternative education programs in Texas. We refer to them as JJPs. The Texas legislature created the concept of JJPs in 1995 during an extensive rewrite of our Texas Education Code. The legislative intent was for the JJPs to provide a quality alternative education setting for expelled youth that would focus on discipline, behavior management, and academic achievement. This legislation that created JJPs mandated a separate educational setting to ensure a safe and protective classroom through the removal of dangerous and disruptive students while addressing and resolving the issue of expelling youth receiving no educational services during the period of expulsions. Local juvenile boards in counties with populations over 125,000 were required to implement and operate JJAEPs. This impacted 27 counties, encompassed 283 school districts. These counties accounted for approximately 76% of the state juvenile justice population. Some of the requirements that these programs have to follow include enabling students to perform at grade level. They must operate 7 hours a day, 180 days a year. That is a regular school year in Texas. They must focus on the core curriculum of English, language arts, mathematics, science, and social studies, and finally self-discipline. They must adhere to minimum standards set by my agency. They have to maintain instructional staff ratios, caseworker to student ratios, and supervision ratios. They're required to be administered the statewide assessment instrument that is used in all public schools in Texas, and those scores are attributed back to their home campuses. And the importance of attributing those scores back to their students' home campuses was to maintain the interest of the school districts in what is occurring in those programs and their continued interest in the progress of their students. They also earn credits for the work that they complete while they're attending these programs. These programs serve students between the ages of 10 and 21. We serve approximately 7,000 students in these programs annually. These students are primarily classified in 3 categories. They're mandatory expulsions, which are students who are required by our Texas Education Code to be expelled from public school for very serious felony-type offenses, primarily against person, and felony drug offenses, and of course weapons. We also have discretionary expulsions, which is determined by the local school districts according to their student codes of conduct, and this would include things like misdemeanor drug and alcohol offenses and terroristic threat, and unfortunately serious or persistent misconduct, which is defined by those local school districts. We also have a category of other students who are students who can be ordered by the court into these programs. The design and implementation of JJPs is determined locally, primarily through the development of memorandums of understanding between the school districts and juvenile boards. They vary in size. Their capacities vary from 27 per day to 442 per day. They may be operated solely by the juvenile probation departments in collaboration with the local school district or with a private vendor. In addition to the core curriculum that I've spoken about, they also provide other services to students in the program: individual counseling, substance abuse, service learning projects, mental health evaluations. They provide wraparound and family support services also. We're also required to measure how these programs are performing. We use 2 primary academic measures. One is, again, the state assessment that is administered to all students in Texas. And then the second is a pre and post test to see if they're showing some academic gain while they're in the JJPs. Another area that we analyze is their behavioral improvement. That's what got them into the programs was behavior, and we certainly need to address that. We look at programs' overall attendance, and we also look at, once they complete the program and return to the public school system, behaviorally have their referrals for behavioral incidences declined. We also look at recontact rates to the juvenile justice system, and once they leave, we measure that for a 6-month period after they leave the program and a year. The Texas legislature has made bold changes to the juvenile justice system and the Texas public education system by assuring that no child falls out of the educational system. The key to this successful implementation is local cooperation and a seamless system where students are not allowed to fall between the cracks. Ultimately, the juveniles served in these programs benefit by being served in this unique educational setting. My time is up, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Cave.
Good morning, Madam Chair, and also Chairman Scott. It's my pleasure to be here today to talk about what we're doing in Virginia to support children in alternative education and those that are at risk. Beginning with the actions of the General Assembly, the General Assembly directed the Board of Education to develop regional alternative educational programs where 2 or more school divisions can come together and have a place for their last chance kids to go. These are the kids that have violated student code of conduct, have been suspended and expelled. They have chronic disruptive behavior. They have instances of assault, of weapons, of drug and alcohol abuse. It's their place to go on a short-term basis to get intensive individualized instruction and support. The General Assembly mandated that the instructional program within these alternative regional educational programs had to be extremely rigorous, and so they abide by the Virginia Department of Board of Education standards of learning, which are our standards of what every child should know, and the children are also tested while they're in these programs. In addition, these alternative education programs provide career counseling, support the kids. There's a low teacher-to-student ratio, so that they're extremely structured. We follow up the board reports on their success annually, and we have found that behavior improves, that weapons incidents and incidents of assault go down, and of violence. The testing is not where we want it to be, but we've seen that over the period of several years, standards of learning testing has increased. For them, the success rate has increased. We also noted that in 2007, 2008, 84% of these kids either stayed in the alternative program and graduated, or they went back to their home schools and completed schools. We do lose some drop out, but we feel as though we have a good completion rate and we continue to work. Also in our detention programs, the state-operated programs are run through my office. We ensure that kids in detention still have an academic program that's rigorous and follows the Virginia standards of learning, and we ensure that we have highly qualified teachers. Within the state of Virginia, the Department of Correctional Education is responsible for the programs for kids. We have 9 juvenile schools, and voluntarily the Department of Correctional Education abides by the Virginia Board of Education standards of learning. They abide by their accreditation standards, which means they test kids, and they also have the appropriate staffing ratios and have to follow the regs, as Ms. Brooke was discussing. Voluntarily, they've increased their standards of learning assessment success rate from 29% to 80% this year, and that's because they have individualized performance analysis for each one of their kids. They have highly qualified teachers, they have school improvement programs, and they have coaches for their kids. And they work in cooperation with us, very close relationship. Of course, no matter how well you have your standards, you know that the transition from a school division to a correctional facility or detention and back again is where we lose kids. And we found out in Virginia that we had tons of problems. We were losing kids. School divisions didn't know they were coming. They came back to school. They were lost. I had the occasion to talk to kids in detention. And I talked to one and said, what are you going to do when you come back to school? And he said, I don't know. There's nothing at school for me. And that's exactly the problem. There's no safety net. These kids have been in very structured programs. They come back, and they could be lost. There could be no academic program planned for them. So we got our agencies together, Department of Juvenile Justice, Department of Correctional Education, Department of Education, Court Services, and we said, and parents, and citizens, and kids, and said, what can we do? And we came up, the Virginia Board of Education, promulgated re-enrollment regulations because the General Assembly mandated that they should, and because we knew that this was a problem. And there are key important elements of these re-enrollment regs. Primarily, there has to be accountability in each agency for getting this job done. There's a transition team at the Department of Correctional Education. There's a point person who is the principal. At the school division level, there's a re-enrollment team appointed responsible person, a re-enrollment coordinator. There are specified timelines for when information must be passed between the different agencies. The academic record of the child must be maintained at all times. Before they return to a school division, there must be an academic program and a plan. When they come to the Reception and Diagnostic Center from the school division, the record has to come with them. So because the board enacted these kinds of procedures, we've seen a great increase in success rates of kids coming back. Just one quick story, we had a 16-year-old who was in an alternative ed situation, came to detention because of behavioral problems. The detention center built a relationship with the home school, got a highly qualified teacher in chemistry to work individually with this child so they could maintain their credits towards graduation and be successful. And what we found is that the kid coming back to the school is not the kid that went into the detention center, into the correctional facility. They change, and often they're successful. But if school divisions don't realize that, if they have no information, if there's no joint communication, if there's no relationship between these agencies, then you can't build for the success for the child. And I see it's time for me to stop, but this is a good place to stop.
Thank you very much. Dr. Whitemore?
I'd like to thank Chairwoman McCarthy and Ranking Member Mr. Platts, and Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Mr. Gomert for the opportunity for holding this hearing and the opportunity to testify before you today. I'm the CEO of Manitou Incorporated, a private nonprofit organization based in Pennsylvania. I began my career as a juvenile probation officer in Pennsylvania, and I've worked with at-risk adolescents in alternative settings for 36 years. 30 years ago, a colleague and I wrote a federal grant and initiated a day treatment program for court-adjudicated youth with the hope of keeping them in the community and in their family settings. Today, Manitou operates programs in 11 counties in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and on a daily basis serve over 600 students. Most students placed in alternative education settings are failing in a traditional public school setting due to a complexity of behavioral, social, and mental health issues. All the students who enter Manitou alternative education centers have violated one of the defined offenses under Pennsylvania Disruptive Youth Guidelines: violation of school policies, drug possession, weapon possessions, disruptive behavior or defiance, and truancy. The placement time is usually a short duration of 6 months to a year. Their presenting issues are multifaceted and complex. Many can be described as having difficult temperaments and are slow to read nonverbal social cues in others and struggle with interpersonal relationships. They are more sensitive to changes in their environment, are more volatile, and are more at risk for impulsive reactions. These children have the greatest problems adjusting to public school, and they often become a frequent flyer in the juvenile justice system. Specifically, they are the students who are experimenting with drugs and alcohol, students who have poorly developed social skills that frequently result in aggression, violence, and irresponsible decision-making. Students who are experiencing mental health issues of being oppositionally defiant, attention deficits, or conduct disorders, and students who exhibit learning disabilities and are several years behind in grade level. They have all lost interest in attending school, complying with school rules, or performing well academically. Many of these students are living in poverty, living in communities plagued with violence on the streets, coming from families where family role models are or have been in prison, and have parents who are addicted to drugs and alcohol. Students bring all these social and behavior issues with them into the alternative setting in which they are placed. These behavioral issues often act as an impediment to the student being able or even willing to learn. Our first priority is to address the complicated and interwoven social and behavior issues by providing an array of services that include social skills development, life skills and career education, service learning projects, mental health counseling, and academic instruction. Our education programs focus on basic reading, writing, math, and credit recovery. During my 30 years of professional experience working with at-risk youth, I've seen an erosion of respect for other individuals, a decline in acceptance of authority and organizational structures, a deterioration in the social bonds of communities and families, and an increase in the severity of personal issues and needs. I've also seen a reluctance of the people responsible for solving these problems to develop solutions that are focused on saving our children. We continue to work within categorical silos that shift responsibility for funding our education and social services between agencies. Many times the needs of our children get ignored in this process. The question placed before us is, are at-risk youth missing out on educational opportunities while in foster care, juvenile justice facilities, alternative education settings, and other environments? These students began missing out on educational opportunities in our traditional public schools due to their inability to deal with the issues that they experience. In reality, the public school system alone does not have the resources to address these issues. Our children involved in alternative settings within the juvenile justice and foster care systems need alternative education environments that can provide consistency in services and address their needs. Our financial resources and our work efforts at the local level should be combined into one collaborative, seamless system that could deliver services to children. Services can be delivered to students based on an assessment of their risk and protective factors, and interventions provided based on the need level identified. These integrated services should be provided as part of a school-wide service system. By combining our resources and focus, our children, our schools, and our communities will benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Whitemore. Mr. Dixon?
Madam Chairman, thank you for allowing me to be here. I'd like to also thank my county executive for paying for me to come here, which is a major piece. One of the things that I want to do is, you have my record, is I've come from the bottom of the system to the top, which means that I've started as a line worker to a state director. And I had an opportunity to see everything in between in these 29 plus years. And I've traveled across this country and had an opportunity to see the good, the bad, and the ugly of what goes on in our system. And I found myself wondering, how did we get here? And the question to me is always, if it was our children in these systems, what would we do to make things better for them? I worked in Florida, and I worked doing the Bobby M, system, doing the Bobby M time, and it was a good experience when someone else comes in and looked at your system. The issue really becomes, in my mind, do we have the political will to tackle a lot of the problems that we see with our young people and the cost that's attributed to that? What we do in Wayne County, I think we have one of the best systems that I've been able to be associated with. And one of the reasons why that is because we look at kids from a holistic approach. We triage kids who come into the detention facility, because what we found is that we have kids who have mental health issues, medical issues, and health issues. And if a kid is hungry, can't see, and in pain, it's going to be very difficult to educate them. And I think we have to look at those things that are going on in our communities. The statistics, again, is in the testimony, and I won't go through that now. But our data has been very good on kids not returning into the system, or either not moving up to the next level, because we know that the next level is going into the adult system. And when they go into the adult system, the question really becomes, are we really concerned about how much we spend? Because we know it costs much more to house a person in the adult system after they've left the juvenile justice system. And so the issue is, what are we doing about the prevention measures? When kids are coming to school, we talk about zero tolerance, and what I found is that zero tolerance is really, without being politically correct, a lazy person's way of not wanting to work with kids. And we have to understand that. We have to put a lot of effort in to working with these children. And I'm concerned because of my own children and making sure that they have a place that's safe, because what happens with our kids and what we don't do affects everyone in this room, from our insurance rates to our school, our taxes, and the whole 9 yards. And I think we have to be concerned about that. The reason I'm passionate about this is that I've been able to see a lot. And one of the things that we have to do when we're talking about, we have to funding. No one wants to talk about funding these programs properly. And if you're going to do it, we're going to have programs funded to the point where we can look at the medical issues that are happening with kids. I have kids that come into my institution that can't see. So how do we expect for them to learn if they can't see? I have kids who come into my institutions who have have not seen a dentist in the time that they've been on this earth. A quick story, we had a young man that come into our institution. He got into fights all the time. The kids used to have names for him. When we fixed his teeth, do you know that the kid never got into another fight after that? That's what we're talking about here, is really looking at the kids as we look at our own kids. And we would not look at what it was costing first when we're looking at our kids. We would look at what's the best system for our kids. Then we'd look at the other part of it. And I think we have it backwards. We need to look at how we're going to spend our money, but is it good money being spent to turn these kids around and to reduce the recidivism rates and things that are happening, in our systems. And I think that's one of the things that we have to do.
Thank you, Mr. Dixon. Ms. Steele?
Thank you, Chairwoman McCarthy, Chairman Scott, and members of the subcommittee. I want to thank you for this hearing on children who are really often forgotten. I'm here as a founder of the Learning Rights Law Center and as the executive director. I'm here in the audience as the co-founder, Inez Cooper-Schmidt. Our sole mission is equity in education for all students, including students that are in the foster care juvenile justice system and children with disabilities. We're a community-based legal services organization, as in my testimony, and our programs are aimed at preventing students from crossing from foster care system into the juvenile justice system, as well as any students entering the system because of a school failure. I'm here also to tell you about myself, because when I talk about the children we serve, we're one and the same. I was raised by a single mother in downtown Hollywood, California. My middle school experience was filled with the street, the drugs, and friends, because they were much more interesting than school. By high school, education was the last thing on my mind, because I knew I was bright, but I just couldn't do the work. I didn't go to class, and I failed. No one ever asked why. So I quit high school and went into an alternative setting, at that time, an adult school to finish. I lost my 20s to addiction, homelessness because I ended up living on friends' couches, and depression. Thankfully, I hit a bottom and attended a community college where they diagnosed my learning disability. My learning disability includes a reading disorder, dyslexia, a writing disorder, and ADD. After my diagnosis, I learned about the law and my rights to get accommodations. And I learned to use my intellect and began to access education. After a tremendous amount of hard work, I graduated from UCLA Law School in 1999 and have dedicated my entire life to helping others like myself and those less fortunate. My life is not different from many of the youth we work with. They face far more segregation and isolation than I ever did. If I were placed in one of today's alternative schools, I wouldn't be here today. Our alternative schools are warehouses. They're where society sends children that they just don't want to educate. Warehouse is actually too neutral, too generous a term for the criminal effect on the individual. Foster youth are a particular vulnerable population. One foster youth said, "They think I'm crazy. They think I have a mental health issue. All I have is a broken heart." The education and social welfare are too quick to label foster youth as disturbed and needing isolation. Foster youth living in group homes are systematically placed into alternative settings without regard to their right to attend a least restrictive public education. I met Mary. Mary was a youth with a learning disability who lived in a group home, who attended a group home school that was located at the same place she lived. She wanted to be a singer. She wanted to be in the choir at the public school, but she couldn't because they required her and all the other children that lived there to attend their school, the on-ground school. She was physically restrained over 20 times, once because of a hairbrush. She was thrown to the floor and restrained with a 4-point restraint when these adults put her on the floor and held her down. She should have never been there. When we got involved as advocates, we got her out, and she graduated. It's unacceptable. The cost to you, to us, was $30,000 for a private school paid by public funds. It's unacceptable. Mary is not an isolated case. It may sound like it, but it's not. Learning Rights works with hundreds of youth that are in overly restrictive placements. We can't forget about other at-risk youth, like Carrie. He's in my testimony. He had an IEP. He has special education needs. It actually required that he actually was able to walk away when he got into trouble. Instead, one time he tried to walk away, and a security guard grabbed him. He was tased several times, arrested, and sent to an alternative schools. There should be definitely more oversight in alternative settings, but our priority should be prevent these at all costs, because they shouldn't be there. We shouldn't use public money to warehouse students. And in this economy, we should definitely think about education and not incarceration. The cost is so much different. It's $8,000 to educate, and in California, it's upwards of $70,000 when we look at detaining youth in the juvenile justice system. Thank you.
I want to thank everybody for their testimony. It's amazing how from Dr. Bloomberg all the way down to Ms. Steele, we were hearing the same message. And that's basically, how do we get to these kids at an early age? When I first started on this committee 13 years ago, we had an attorney general come to testify in front of our committee, the full committee. And at that time, the attorney general had said if we invested an extra 25 cents per child, we would save so much money because that child wouldn't go into the juvenile justice system. I'm sure the money is a little bit more today. But it comes down to, we are facing a different culture out there. You know, the kids are watching too much TV, they're on the internet too much, they're not getting out and playing in the fresh air, and well, let's face it, some parents don't want their kids to go out and play because they're afraid of what's going on the streets. So where are we? It does come back to me, as far as I'm concerned, pre-kindergarten, preschool, and stay with it. And hopefully one day we'll see this country really invest in education the way we see some of our other nations, mainly because they know it's a security and economical threat if we don't do that to this nation. But my question will be, because I'll be honest with you, I guess my question could be for all of you, because you're actually, you know, going through this same testimony just about, that, you know, getting to the kids, giving them the holistic care that they need, and the services all in one place just about. My curiosity would be, and it was touched on a little bit, that when the kids got back into the school, those that were followed up with that particular guidance that they needed, obviously if you got a 10-year-old, you have a longer period of time to follow them. If you've got a 16 or a 17-year-old, you don't have a longer period of time. So I'm just wondering what happens to those older children, only because I know the way our laws are across the station, they hit that across the nation, that 18 to 21-year-old group. They usually end up in jail. Mm-hmm. And all my correctional guards keep telling me, give us teachers, get these kids out of here. All they need to do is to be educated. They had some problems, but where they were was not helping them. So I guess my question, I'll go back to, how do we follow those kids? How do we get better data so that we can show everybody that this is going on and hopefully can make a difference in these children's lives? A lot of kids nowadays, but hopefully the future of these children. Ms. Cave, Dr. Cave?
Two answers to your question. One is that the state of Virginia has been able to develop an educational information management system, because we realized if we don't know who these kids are and we can't monitor them and keep track of them through their school system, we don't know what happens to them. So we actually have an identifier for every student, and it's a testing identifier, and we're able now to calculate a true and accurate dropout rate because we actually know what happens to kids. We follow them. We are able, we've just really started with this system in 2005, 2006, but we're now experimenting with flagging different characteristics. We have a pilot program for children in 8th grade, and we know from research that there are early indicators of probability of not completing school or being at risk. We know their behavior problems. We know that their attendance is a dominant issue. And we have, through a pilot program through our school improvement office, indicators that that we can not mark, that's not the right word, but indicators that we can track for kids. How often do they miss school? Are their grades declining? Do they have discipline issues? And through that, we can try to identify them in 8th grade, intervene early, and begin to follow whether our interventions are doing any good or not. With the re-enrollment regs, we require that the child coming back, the youth coming back, has a weekly counseling system, weekly counseling for as long as the school division determines is necessary, and we also require that they have followed that child so that they just don't come back and get lost. So those are two things that are helpful if you can identify kids early. If you have a way, you have to have a mechanism, the data, to track them.
It seems we're always coming back to data. Kim and I love to do data. That's our big thing. Anybody else? Dr. Bloomberg?
Yes, I think one of the key things is to track the youth, particularly coming out of juvenile facilities, that return to school, stay in school, and whether or not they get a high school diploma. All the research establishes that the receipt of a high school diploma then disproportionately predisposes those youth to a conventional life career. And what is really exciting, and I think in terms of tracking all of these kids, generally about 90% of the kids coming out are really optimum to return to school. And that necessarily is not the public school, maybe an alternative school. And we haven't talked much about alternative schools, but they do need to be part of your equation with lost opportunities. The alternative schools typically around America operate, we've got about 100 of them in Florida. They operate as an alternative to suspension or expulsion. But also they operate as a transition for kids coming out of institutions and perhaps are not ready to transition right back into their public school. What we found in Florida, we don't have the resources for these alternative schools. Many of these children make it in alternative schools. They love the structure, they love the smaller classes, and they succeed. And they don't want to go back to the public schools, but the issue is, got to go back, you've got your 65 days. So again, I think high school diploma, return to school high school diploma is very important, but also getting the schools, and this is where I come back to accountability. It's not enough to mandate best practices. You must have accountability. There's got to be follow-up with these programs, and quite frankly, our experiences in Florida, as well as our national work with other states implementing No Child Left Behind in juvenile justice schools, has indicated they like knowing just what you want to know. Look, you're sitting here, you're legislators, you want to make responsible decisions, but you don't have good data. You can't even describe the problem very well because of these different issues. So it is a challenge.
I agree with you on the alternative schools, because I know a couple of kids that had gone through the system, went to the alternative schools, did go back into their regular high school, and within 2 weeks, they intentionally made an infraction on their probation or whatever, so they were back in the alternative school because they liked the structure. Now, I come from the old way. I don't see why all our schools don't have that structure for everybody, to be very honest with you. Mr. Scott?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. We've heard a lot about the need to pay for some of these services and the challenges of coming up with the money. The fact of the matter is we're already paying. The charts on incarceration show that at least 10 states have an African-American incarceration rate of over 4,000 per 100,000. International average is about 100. The United States is #1 in the world at 700. And if you look at what we are paying per child in that excess incarceration, if you do the arithmetic, it's somewhere in the $3,000 per child per year. And if you target that to those that are at risk, you could easily spend $10,000 per child per year if you have effective intervention programs. So I guess my first question is whether or not you have risk assessments to really show which ones are at risk. Anybody?
Could you repeat that again?
Which do you have risk assessments that can really show which children are at risk? I think Mr. Bloomberg.
There are a lot of, as a matter of fact, we're just in my journal, Criminology and Public Policy, we're publishing a series of policy debates about risk assessments. A lot of debate about risk assessments and just how accurate they are. What we do know in criminology unequivocally is the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. With the children that we're talking about in terms of lost education opportunities, we have been doing, again, I mentioned earlier, our cohort studies. And again, most of these children are, particularly those that are beyond the 3, that include 4, 5, and 6 years behind their age grade level, their likelihood of returning to public school is just about nil. Very difficult, and so we've assessed that. But additionally, a thing that you mentioned, disproportionate African American involvement. Of our high education achievers that are incarcerated, where we control for race, for example, and we look at African American youth who have experienced above average academic achievement while incarcerated, compare them with white youth who've also experienced higher academic achievement, African American youth are almost double in the likelihood to return to school upon release. Now, that's something that we've really been trying to explain, because it suggests to us that African American youth have been subject to probably a lot of negative labeling in the public school, disproportionate negative labeling, we assume, and when they get into the juvenile justice schools and experience success, this success is pretty profound. They're able to apparently deal with that success, and we're able to deflect the negative cues a little bit better in the public school than were their white counterparts. And that's called labeling theory. But this finding, we think, is very hopeful about what we would be doing, because if you look at risk assessments, they would say African American youth are much less likely to return to school. But if they academically achieve, we're showing almost double the likelihood to return to school.
Well, if you have a risk assessment to show those that are at risk, are there things you can do to change the trajectory that are cost effective?
If I can answer that, I will say, again, as a criminologist who have studied crime for 36 years, yes. Yes, if you can get children to academically achieve disproportionately, that despite all the risk factors that say they're on a trajectory, because the best thing we know in criminology is persistence over the life course. Small kids become adolescent delinquents and young adult criminals. But when they experience that adolescent turning point with academic achievement, they begin to bond with school, with conventional society. They become less helpless and hopeless, and just like any of us, they see light.
Have you shown rigorous studies that show that those programs work and save more money than they cost?
It would be easy to show the long-term costs. Our program's getting excellent teachers and working. The amount of money, I heard one of my fellow testimoniers here make the comment, the amount of money is small. Have I done the explicit study that you're asking for? No, but it certainly could be done.
If I could answer or address that question. There are a number of programs that have initiated studies of risk factors and protective factors, and that if you can identify the risk factors and protective factors, that is what you focus your interventions on. The communities of care model out of the state of Washington, and is used on a national basis, has been adopted extensively by the state of Pennsylvania and integrated into communities where they build programs around those risk and protective factors. The Search Institute out of Minnesota has also done extensive research over years on identifying the same 40 risk factors, different set, but the same 40 risk and protective factors. And we are now working with a gentleman from North Carolina who's done research, brain resiliency research, and has developed an assessment tool to identify the same factors. And how do we integrate that into our intervention programs?
Thank you. Dr. Cave?
Dr. Whitmore stole my thunder a little bit, except I wanted to say that John Hopkins has been studying early indicators of dropout, really in dropout provisions with the cities of Philadelphia. And as early as 4th grade, you can tell that a child's on a trajectory. If they have lost if they can't achieve academically, if they miss school, and then as you go to the middle schools, you see that if their grades fail, that's a good predictor. So as early as elementary school, we can start to identify these kids. And what we want to do is intervene educationally, and also we want to intervene with the individualized support. When you look at the risk and resiliency factors, teacher engagement is one of the highest resiliency factors that are available. So then training our staffs to understand that they can influence a child, that connection, that engagement. We were able to hold a dropout prevention summit last October for all sectors, and we had some model programs, speakers from model programs in the state and also in the nation come and speak with us. And we saw that we could have non-traditional programs. In Virginia, the Commission on Youth has studied alternative education, the General Assembly. They're starting to use the term non-traditional programs instead of alternative education, just to get away from the stigma of alternative ed. But we have some non-traditional programs in Virginia that are focused specifically on overaged kids, so that they are together and so they get the individual assistance that they need, and they get flexible schedules so they can work. They can meet other family obligations and still be in school. We have non-traditional programs for kids that have been in trouble, and this is part of the school division. It's not something that the state is doing.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think one of the issues, I know in Wayne County, one of the things when we look at the data, when I keep talking about holistic approach, we tend not to look at the kids who are also in special education. And that becomes a very significant group of kids. And what we found was that when you said earlier, when our teachers engage these kids along with staff, then we find out that they become more successful. One of the problems that we find is that these kids have not had anyone who has been able to really sit down and engage them and look at them differently. And when you look at it differently, when you're dealing with them, then the kids pick those kinds of things up. Those are things that you can't put data on. You can't. But there are human things that we know that affect kids and how they respond to things. And when we do those kinds of things, we see success. When you look at our charts, you can see where kids who we only have for 30 days grow up, their grade levels increase, 1 or 2 grade points. That's because someone has really taken the time. And a lot of these kids cannot function in large environments. And so you have to place them in smaller environments so that they can be successful. And we have to take I keep saying the political will to say, do we want to take these kids? And when you place kids in smaller environments, yeah, it's going to cost you more. We know that. But the issue is the long-term effect of it is it costs you less. And so those are the kind of things that you can't put, I think one of the problems, and I'll be very brief, I think one of the problems is that we want to, data, I use data for a lot of stuff. But I think one of the things that we have to be concerned about, that you can't use data when you're talking about the human factor in things sometimes, because there's always, in my years, I found out that the human factor overrides a lot of the stuff that we're talking about. We can test, we can do all those things, but we really have to understand how do you engage these kids. And when we engage these kids, then what I found is that they become successful.
We're actually going to be able to come for another round. Mr. Platts?
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I want to echo where you started, and it really goes to Mr. Dixon, your statement of how we look at the needs of these children if they were our own children, and how I've got a 9-year-old, a 12-year-old, and what is their need, and then how do I try to meet that need, as opposed to not what's it going to cost, and I mean that's certainly a part of that decision-making process, and I think it is the political will of us as a nation, especially at the early stages, and where we're failing so many kids by the time they get to this whole system of alternative ed is 0 to 5, and the chairwoman mentioned pre-K issues, Head Start, early Head Start. There's so many datas. The Ypsilanti, Michigan study, it shows now over 40 years, if we do right in child care and preschool, the savings is like 16 times back to the taxpayers by that investment up front. Danny Davis, my Democratic colleague from Illinois, and I have legislation, Education Begins at Home, about how to teach, especially low-income single teen moms, how to be a parent. And so that foundation is established early on. And yes, it's going to cost money, and Nurse-Family Partnership in Pennsylvania is a great example of this effort, but the long-term return is dramatically more than what it's going to cost, and that's the difficulty for us as a government, is willingness to make the upfront cost, knowing that the return is going to be much greater. It may be 20 years down the road, but it's going to be much greater, and I think you capture that in how we approach our own children, how we do that in a broader sense. And I hope, actually, President Obama, both in his State of the Union and his speech to the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce this week, talked about education begins at home. And so we're hoping that's a push for legislation that we think will pay great dividends in the long term. I want to, Dr. Whitmore, in the chairwoman's first question about tracking your students, and I think you were going to follow up on, or wanted to answer or address that. I wanted to ask you specifically to your students at Manitou, how they typically arrive at your door, and how does a student arrive in your program, how long they typically are with you, and then what ability do you have once they return to a home district or out of your program to track their long-term success?
Students come to us on many different reasons because we offer various options for them. The typical students for us are just assigned there either by the juvenile court or by the school district. This is one of those interesting shifts that I've seen in the systems, is that we used to take exclusively juvenile court commitments. And when Pennsylvania initiated the Disruptive Youth Act and schools started taking more responsibilities, our population has shifted to today maybe 3% of our students are assigned to us by juvenile court. The rest are all by the school districts. However, 50% of our students are on probation. So it's just what we do and how the students get to us and the students that we see have remained the same. It's just been a shifting of the cost burden to the public schools, which they really can't or are having a hard time to endure. Students stay with us from anywhere from a minimum of 45 days, and we've had students for 5 years. The typical range is 6 months to a year. Typically, the students are expelled for a school year because of violating one of the designated expulsion offenses, and so they come with us for that school year, remainder of the school year, the next school year, and then they will return to the public school. And we try to track them as much as we can afterwards. Frankly, we don't have the resources to spend a lot of time tracking, and also we deal with a very mobile population. It's hard to keep track with it. If I could address one of the Chairwoman McCarthy's comments about the students that are older, we do run an alternative high school for students 16 to 21 who want to drop out or bored with school or have dropped out and want to come back because many of them are single parents, they're working, they're living independently. And we've been doing that program for a little over 10 years, and we just had our, I think it's 1,085th student who's graduated with a high school diploma. And we recently had a young man who had dropped out of school, just simply bored, came back, received his diploma through our program, and graduated with a dual major from Drexel University in architecture and civil engineering. So they are students who are extremely capable. They just do not fit into to the traditional setting. And so we need to offer programs that just address students that are bored and want an education but not the traditional one, and those that are experienced, as Mr. Dixon said, that holistic approach of the behavior and the social issues.
Yep. Good.
To add that, add to that, Dr. Kunjufu out of Illinois has done an enormous amount of studies on African American boys, and one of the issues really has to do with what we call the fourth grade syndrome, where African American boys really started having problems. They started acting out and they started doing all those kinds of things. And once you go in and you start addressing those issues from when they're in the fourth grade, because they're more active, they have more activity going on, they actually are larger, and so the teachers have a harder time trying to distinguish how they work with those kids. And I know that for a fact because if I had not have read the book, when my son was in the fourth grade in Miami, the teachers called to say that he was acting out. I went to the school, met with the teachers, and talked to them. They were saying, well, your son, when he finishes his work, he starts acting out in the classroom. My issue to them was, okay, I'll deal with the acting out part, but why don't you give him more work? Maybe he won't act out. And so what happens is, when we get to that fourth grade piece, kids, nobody wants to deal, and that's when we talk about zero tolerance and all those kinds of things. Well, kick them out, do all of this. Well, the real problem is that we need to understand that these kids are very active, and we have to look at their activities and how do, like the chairwoman said, how often are they going outside? How often are they engaged and not just sitting? And like you said earlier, those are some very significant things. They get bored. And when they get bored, we know what kids do when they get bored. Another quick, story, we had a governor, which I won't call names, we had a governor who was talking about not placing kids in alternative programs. Well, that's a waste of money, you lock them up and all that. It was interesting when I talk about political will. When his son got in trouble, his son was going around with another kid putting firecrackers in mailboxes. When his son got in trouble, he actually became a proponent of alternatives because his child got in trouble. And that's when I go back to, when it's our children, we find the political will to do what we need to do.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I look forward to a second round, and Ms. Steele and all of you have great issues, and look forward to additional questions. Thank you.
Mr. Goldmark?
Hey, thank you, Madam Chair, and appreciated all the testimony. It seems like one of the problems with what I was hearing is when you're putting kids in temporary situations in schools, we haven't had the seamlessness that we should be. That seemed to be a more common theme of what I was hearing. And little disclosure here, my wife taught school in an alternative school called PACE in our hometown for a number of years, and she just loved it because she said, these are kids, the light comes on and it's so exciting. But they were computer programs, and they all had instructors and whatnot. But I'm wondering, I haven't heard anybody address this, but some of us were brought up with the Socratic method, and it was good for us to have to stand up like in law school and recite, but getting that growing up. But I've wondered, when we talk about that positive reaction, Dr., is it Bloomberg or Blomberg? Okay. It seems like they get that from computer programs, and it seems like most kids now, if they're embarrassed to say they can't read, they like doing it at their own pace. What do you see as the future of education, and throw this open for computer programs as self-paced, where they get that encouragement sometimes, versus the Socratic? Ms. Steele?
I'm familiar with the Socratic method, so, and so there's a couple of things. I mean, I think one of them is that when we think of we're looking at alternative schools, there are a range of them. They're
Right.
continuations. We see in Southern California independent study. I mean, there's a far range, which is why I'm a proponent. Is like, how can we keep kids in their community schools and make sure that they have the opportunities as all the other students? And if it's reorganizing them to look at them as small settings, great. When it comes to computers, I'm just going to tell a quick story. I read with books on tape. Because when I visually read, I only see the words in the center of the page, and I only get what is called, I call it black and white, whereas when I read with books on tape, it's color. It's like a movie. So technology is the gateway. It really will change children's lives. Every kid needs their books on tape, right? And it may be different, but I think if you can imagine, this is the population we serve. So we are adamant because what we see is pretty dire. And that we have to fight to get books on tape. I went through law school, and do you know what it's like for me to say, oh, by the way, we need books? Oh, no, they have to learn to do it on their own.
Right.
Why do we require that? Why aren't we looking at alternative ways of learning? Because you know what? If that student could learn an alternative way using technology, they may actually be able to be more successful in their life.
Some things would work better for different children.
Because they're pretty good at MySpace, by the way.
And I do enjoy books on tape or CD.
Exactly.
In fact, but my wife doesn't, and she said, well, you're oral. I said, is that better than being anal? I'm not sure. But anyway, any other comments? Yeah, Dr. Blomberg?
One thing, and it's actually in my outline of my testimony, but we all talk about the critical importance of highly qualified teachers. But the reality is that many of these programs, these alternative education programs that we're talking about, have very small populations. And when we talk about highly qualified teachers, we typically mean highly qualified teachers teaching in their area of professional certification. That's not possible realistically across the nation with all the various juvenile justice schools and alternative schools. And I think that's where video, a national curriculum, I think video-assisted instruction, individualized module instruction, the technology has so many capabilities, and then we get some of these wonderfully accomplished teachers, these highly qualified teachers that are very much involved in video presentation and so on. So I think the technology is essential if we're to move this whole area forward.
But then you bring up one of my pet concerns. We had a governor who came in with the head of education in Texas and showed some improvements in Texas. So when they came to Washington, they decided to ram it down everybody else's throat as well. And I had real concerns that we didn't need the national model rammed down everybody else's throat, that Connecticut may not want to have to teach like Texas did. And then another thing, it seems like the more federal control you get, and I was really hoping with the Democratic majority and a Democratic president, we'd get away from some of this cram down in education, because I was not a fan and am not a fan of No Child Left Behind, because I saw us losing music programs, art programs, physical education, seeing, you know, everybody having to fit in this mold as it was expected, and I hate to get away from that state control. And Dr. Cave, when you talk about somebody saying there's nothing in school for me, I'm sure all of us have heard kids say that. And you wonder, well, why have we gotten away? We used to have automotive shop. We had construction. We had welding. We had ag shop. And not everybody had to go to college, but they got that positive feedback from what they were doing. And, you know, a welder making $80,000, you know, may seem poor or rich, depending on you, but that's a good living in East Texas, and people wouldn't have to go to college, but they're not getting that option now as a part of their education. So I really wish we did a better job of assessing individually on a local basis without being crammed down from the federal government. But then, and you've pointed out, and I think a number of people up here, you know, the federal government has resources that a lot of local and states don't have. But then, as we've seen in this mess with the financial sector, if you're going to get federal money, then eventually, if it didn't come at first, you're going to get federal dictation. And so that gets back to my concern. So I know this is just a short time. You have 5 minutes to speak, and then we get 5 minutes, but it doesn't mean that if you have other things that you think of that you don't get to say, that those are welcome if you would submit them. And I know Madam Chair would agree, we would welcome that being submitted after the hearing as you think about these things that get generated, and we hope that you won't come away with a negative affirmation from your testimony here, because it is appreciated. But
Judge, may I respond?
Yes, please.
First, the programs that we have in Texas begin at age 10. And I think it's important.
You're talking about the alternative program.
The JJAPs,
yeah, right,
we refer to them. I think it's important that people understand when students are being expelled from public school, that one of the first things that needs to be done with these students is a complete assessment needs to be done to see what's going on. Why is a student acting out?
Going back to Mr. Dixon's point.
Yes,
yeah.
But it needs to be more than an academic assessment. It needs to be a mental health. It needs to be a behavioral health assessment.
Maybe they need teeth.
A health period assessment, that's right, so that we can see what's going on. And once we do a complete assessment, I think we'll find out a lot of these kids aren't learning because there's barriers for that student, and oftentimes barriers for his entire family. And that it's important when we do these assessments and begin working with the students that we embrace the whole family. Because what's going on with this one student is also often going on with his peers, or his siblings, I should say, with his siblings. And it's important that we work with the family by sometimes bringing in very intensive work, multiple, I can't talk, MST, multiple, golly, it's systemic therapy, thank you.
Now you know how it feels for someone with dyslexia.
Well, I'm from Texas and I talk really slow, but because you guys are limiting time, I get tongue-tied. So those are very important resources that any kind of alternative school really needs to have, and that's one of the advantages that Texas has in putting these programs in the juvenile justice system, because we can treat the whole family, and school districts don't have the tools sometimes to entice the family to participate as the courts may have. Yeah. You mentioned the computerized curriculums. There is a good place for those curriculums in schools, but many of our students learn very differently, and each child has to be treated individually, and their education plans need to address specific needs with those students. They come in at all different levels, and programs have to be equipped to address those, and you can't expect them to sit in front of a computer 7 hours a day and be successful. Some kids can, some kids can't. We're also looking at bringing in virtual school programs into these alternative schools so that higher achieving students can engage in those virtual campuses, which is also a great tool for us, especially when we don't have the highly qualified teachers that were being spoken to earlier. And one final comment that I have is related to the data. You asked about whether we were able to track these students. And there is a point where it stops, and that is when they become adults. Crossing systems and removing those barriers between systems, the education folks can certainly tell you who drops out, but getting them to match the data with the, in Texas it would be our Department of Public Safety, to see if there's been arrests and incarcerations is where we are limited. And maybe that's an area that this committee can help take away some of the barriers so that sharing of data and matching of data can be done so better tracking is achievable.
First, let me say I'm all for computers, and I'm all for all the high tech. I mean, if someone had told me 10 years ago I'd be a whiz at computers and my BlackBerry and every other contraption they got on my body to keep in touch, I understand that, you know, it's important. What I was talking about is that too many kids are playing games, some of them extremely violent. We know the younger that they start playing these violent games, they think this is real. They think they can shoot someone and it's not real. That person's going to get up and walk away. Or they think that, you know, they're more powerful than they am. I'm just saying that we have nothing to do with that. Parents, to me, should be overseeing that. But as you said, there are many of these kids don't have. It's become the new babysitter, to be very honest with you. Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee, who is also on the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, Homeland Security, welcome, and a fellow Texan.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for joining with the Judiciary Committee and Chairman Scott for what is a vital, very vital hearing. And I always want to take an opportunity to thank you, of course, for your leadership as it relates to sanity and gun regulation in this country. I think it's very important. The reason why I say that is that I was delayed because we were in a hearing dealing with the enormity of the drug trafficking issues on the border and the violence with guns. So not to say I was reminded of you, but I want to thank you for your leadership on those issues. And we're finding that our juveniles are also being exposed to proliferation of guns in America. But let me thank all the witnesses for their presence here today. And I am chair and have co-founded the Congressional Children's Caucus. Over the years, we've looked at mentoring, intervention, bullying, just a lot of issues that would hopefully focus on making our children's lives better. Let me say that I believe in alternative education, but I believe in it when it is not a way station, when it is not a place for people to, if you will, tread water and sometimes drown. So let me try to ask some pointed questions, and I'm going to go to Mr. Dixon first. If he would single out for me what he thinks would be the most redeeming teaching tool that he has in Wayne County. What have you found to be most effective in the course of dealing with youngsters that have been steered in your direction?
We have one of the tools that we use, we call it a JIF, a juvenile, I'm being dyslexic also, the juvenile
influence something.
Influence something. F, it's JIF.
That's all right.
And it looks at 8 categories. It looks at, you know, the kid's education, looks at his, you know, mental health, looks at his home life, looks at, you know, a variety of issues. And we're able to take that and identify some specific problems that the kid has. You know, if it's in school, if it's health, if it's those kind, if it's family.
So you do an analysis.
We do an analysis.
And then you can treat him or he or she individually, as opposed to like automation.
Right. The issue is an individual.
Right.
And my biggest issue is that we don't bring kids here to warehouse them. And when we look at kids from an individual basis, we were talking about the computers and all those things, all that stuff, you know, is great.
And I'm not going to cut you off, but I have a lot of questions, so I want to just I think the point I'm getting is individual analysis, and you're attempting to get the children out of the system. Is that correct?
Correct.
Not to stay in the system. Do you think your state, and we're not here to embarrass states, I'm going to ask these questions, you think there's enough funding for programs like this?
Oh, no.
And so, you know, someone would ask, there's a 10th Amendment, leave what is not left to the federal government to the states. Is this hearing vital, and does the federal government need to become a real partner in saving our children?
Oh, I think the federal government, the local government, and I talked earlier about the political will. One of the things that I'm comfortable about in our community, which is Detroit, Wayne County, is that the county executive has said, look, we have to look down the road with our children.
So a legislative initiative that may be combined out of these two committees, interesting enough, I'm on the crime subcommittee, that can look at intervention, stopgap measures, you think is a vital approach to take?
It's extremely vital.
Have you seen when you lock up a child and in essence throw away the key, are we advancing ourselves in any way?
No, we're actually paying for it down the road because the kids are going into the adult system, which is costing us you weren't here earlier, and I say politically correct, a hell of a lot more. And we keep doing the same thing and think that we're going to get, some different results. It's not working. And so if it's not working, it's time for us to change the way we do things.
I think that's key. Ms. Brooke, thank you for being here, and let me compliment all of the valiant workers that you have, and just help educate me for a moment, because once you hear my question, the approach that I'm getting ready to take. So I'm going to have to get an apology for a little chastising. But how are you related to the Texas juvenile detention centers across the state? How is the probation
Commission?
Yes. Is this the oversight body over the juvenile detention centers?
We are over the county-operated juvenile facilities, but not the state facilities.
All right. And you understand my angst, and I'm finishing my question, but you understand my angst with the state system and the incidences that we've had, both being way stations, violence, sexual predatory acts against youngsters. Can you just, not from your first-hand knowledge, would you just tell me that the state is working busily to correct all those infractions?
I can tell you that the governor has appointed a permanent executive director for the Texas Youth Commission, as I believe the agency you're
correct.
referring
Thank you.
to. Sherry Townsend is the name of the executive director that's been appointed, and she began, I believe it was October 1st, and I can tell you she is working diligently to make changes and reform the state school system in Texas. Like I said, she's been there since October 1st. My agency has had more dialogue with that agency than we've ever had in the past, and she has put together a plan. As you know, we're in a legislative session now in Texas, and the legislators are working hard themselves to make sure plans are put in place to protect the youth and to progress their rehabilitation.
Thank you. I'll just finish on this note if the rest could answer. My big issue is the mental health component. I don't think we could invest too much money, and that's part of education, part of crime intervention. And so if you all would respond to the idea of institutionalizing the mental health component as part of analysis, as part of treatment, both in the alternative schools, and how much money we need to put in it, or if there's ever enough money to put in to ensure that we look at the mental health of that youngster. Dr. Bloomberg?
No, I could not give you a dollar amount. It's the mental health circumstances of most of these youth. We mentioned that 50% of all those that are incarcerated, delinquent youth that are incarcerated, are suffering from various behavioral or learning disorders compared to roughly 10 to 12% in our public schools. So it is a disproportionate percentage. All of us know, all of you know, that these youth do face some very severe emotional and mental health difficulties that is related to their educational capacities. But again, the wonderful thing about these teachers, and I've watched it in Florida now for 11 years, there are teachers that can, and I don't know how they do it, but they connect with the specific needs of their students, and they do some wonderful things despite all the different histories that that class brings to bear. And these are teachers that are not mental health specialists, but rather many of them are students with disability specialists, and they simply have that ability to provide individualized instruction. But it is a prevalent problem. It continues. Incarcerating the mentally ill has always been an issue, and it exacerbates problems. It doesn't cure them. But unfortunately, we don't have any swift cures about what causes these various mental health problems. We do know that education achievement, despite mental health and various other problems, when these children are experiencing academic achievement, their lives begin to turn around, and a lot of their emotional and other difficulties subside. That's what our longitudinal research in Florida now over the last 11 years has demonstrated. So I'm very hopeful, but you do bring up a very real problem, and it needs to be addressed.
Gentlewoman's time is up.
May Mr. Dixon answer, or I'll be happy to yield back to the chairwoman.
Well, you've actually, you're 4 minutes over.
Okay, all right.
Ms. Clark?
Madam Chair, I'll just yield a moment so that Mr. Dixon and I think Ms. Steele wanted to respond to that.
Yes, Congresswoman. It does cost a lot of money to run a mental health program. We have a mental health program in our institution, and it's a full mental health program with psychiatrists, psychologists, social work, and it costs us about $2 million a year to run that program. But the benefit of it is that we identify a lot of these issues that these kids have so we can address them. On the other part, that one of the things that we're not looking at, though, when kids come in, is the health issue that contributes to some of their mental health issues. And when you find kids who have a multitude of asthma, when they come in, you find kids who, we have kids who have degenerative heart problems. When they're coming to our institutions, that's serious. And we ask the question, why can't these kids function in the school setting? All of those things, when I talk about holistic approach, it's the mental health, it's the medical, it's the education. And I'm telling folks that when I go into institutions, what I find is that a lot of our institutions in this country don't have any of those kinds of things.
Thank you, Mr. Dixon. Ms. Steele, would you quickly?
Yes. One of just the overriding thoughts, I agree, but I don't think it should take getting to an alternative juvenile hall setting to get these services. We know in LA there's the LARC that looks at resiliency and risk factors and says that we know if we don't use the right interventions once they're in juvenile hall, that it's going to go the wrong way. Why are we waiting till then? We also know that there is absolutely no reason those students with learning disabilities should be in a detention facility. There's absolutely no reason. Because if you're providing adequate special education, guess what's included in that? Mental health services, behavior intervention. So those students aren't predisposed to criminal behavior. Many times we see kids incarcerated. We have the opportunity of luckily looking through hundreds of youth education histories as part of our advocacy and overriding they have not been diagnosed, they've not been served, they've not gotten the services. And as a result, if we can look at the front end, because we're missing all the kids that haven't been expelled, that are kind of tracked, hoping they'll get served there, and we're really it's just tracking them the wrong way.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I wanted to thank Chair McCarthy and Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Platts, for holding this very significant hearing. With our President's emphasis and priority on our children's education, this is an area that deserves more scrutiny and emphasis, that our communities can salvage the lives of this subset of our youth. I'm particularly concerned about it because I have a juvenile facility in my district in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm concerned about exactly what we are manufacturing in these types of facilities. You know, with the formerly incarcerated adult experience a variety of challenges upon reentry into their communities. Likewise, many students released from our juvenile justice settings face difficulties when transitioning back into their communities. Among other issues, these youth are often shunned by their principals, teachers, and other students when transitioning back into traditional public school settings. They're also more likely than their classmates to have academic deficiencies, which can further isolate them from their peers. I have a two-part question. First, what are your school systems doing to assist these students in their reentry back into their communities? And second, what can Congress do to assist our nation's school systems in addressing reentry issues experienced by these students? And this question is directed to Dr. Cave, Ms. Brooke, and Mr. Dixon.
Congresswoman, I'm happy to talk to you about the re-enrollment regulations that the Virginia Board of Education passed at the direction of the General Assembly and also in cooperation with the Department of Correctional Education and the Department of Juvenile Justice. We recognize that children coming back into the school systems, although they may have been successful in a very structured environment and a good alternative education program, that when they come back, there's the capacity for them to be lost. If there's no planning for them, if there's no planning for their academic achievement, if they can't have a continuity of instruction, if you can't come from being in Department of Correctional Educational program and continuing your studies with success, if you've had special education supports, you need to know what those have been. You need to know what an individual education plan is, and the receiving school division needs to understand that and plan for it. The receiving school divisions need to know what that child needs, what their progress has been, what their success has been, have they been receiving counseling in order that you can combine the right professionals, and this goes right back to what Mr. Dixon is saying. You need a holistic approach to these kids. You have to look at their family. You have to look at their social supports required. You need to look at the counseling. You need to look at their behavior. And at the school level, you need to pull the professionals together who can share their expertise to look at the whole child and say, when they come back, this is what we're going to do for them. This is what they need. So in Virginia, the regulations that have been passed specified time periods for notification and planning so that a school child that's been released can be back in school in 2 days. That's the goal.
One of the issues is actually record transfer. How do we transfer records, back to the schools, districts, and which that kid is coming from? Based on my experience, I would recommend if the Congress wants to do something, look at the OJJJDP Act, authorize that because it has a lot of good information in it. And what I've found is creating a good case management system so that you can track that kid. And what I mean by a good case management system is one individual who is working with that kid who is brokering the services for that child. And that means that from the time that child comes into the system until the time they leave out, that you have someone that's identified that's tracking that kid. It's like a surrogate parent. Those are the kind of things, then you don't lose. And what is happening in our systems that nobody likes to talk about is that there's a total disconnect, and we're losing information, we're losing all kinds of things because there is no line from one end of the system to the other. And when we do case management from a structured standpoint, then we find out that we can track kids and we know exactly what's going on, because we are losing kids in the community and nobody can tell you where they are. That's the hidden secret that nobody wants to talk about. Nobody knows where the kids are because there's not enough funding to have a good case management system. And then when they fall through the cracks and something occurs, then everyone says, well, we got to figure out someone that we can blame, instead of trying to figure out how do we, track that kid. Just like our kids. We would track our kids from the doctor to the mental health professional because we would do that. That's the same system that we need to create in this country.
I'm going to speak to your question as it relates to our juvenile justice alternative education programs, which are not residential programs, but they're day programs. When a student comes into the JJPs and they've developed a plan for their stay while they're in the programs, they also begin from that point developing their transition plans out, so that they can begin working with that student and his family on what to expect when it's time for the child to depart and go back to his regular public school setting. About 30 days out from the time, or 30 days prior to their leaving, they call in the school district where the student is going back to, they call in the parents, and they meet. And they talk about the successes that the student has had. They talk about the supports that the student will need when he goes back to school. And they create the transition plan, and all the parties agree and sign off, and the student goes back. There's a probation officer typically involved, and that probation officer, juvenile probation officers, do everything. They hold the kid's hand, they're a friend, they're a counselor, they're an enforcer, they do everything. And so they go to the school with the student, and they try to find a mentor at the school to link the student with, so that when they go back, because it's very difficult to go back. These are big schools, there are a number, unfortunately, again, and they're used to the individualized attention that they're getting in our schools. So transitioning is extremely important for them. So we try to link them with an adult that will take the time when they're in school, and if they're having a problem, that student can go to and say, hey, I need some help. Or just someone to come up to the student and say, are you having a good day? That's very important for these kids. So that's what we're doing to help achieve their success.
Thank you, Ms. Brooke. My time has expired. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Scott, you had a question?
I'd ask another question. I'd ask the question to begin with, and I think Ms. Steele didn't have an opportunity to respond. That is, or their cost-effective initiatives. I think she's talked around that. I wanted to know if you'd had an opportunity to address that question, whether or not, if you find people, young people with risk factors, whether or not there are cost-effective ways to intervene.
There's a lot of cost-effective ways to intervene. We are actually working with two juvenile court systems, and we work with, community-based, counselors and social workers, as well with probation, and we look at all of the variety of factors. We look at their education, we look at social and emotional issues, and we come up with a plan of action and talk to the court about how to help them do better in school. But it really takes a team approach and looking at collaboration with the agencies that you're working with to help them integrate back into a public school, because many times what we see is kids ending up being pushed into alternative schools because hundreds of probation officers will tell me we can't get them back into their community schools. And so rather than having a kid linger around for 30 days, I don't know what it's happening in other states, then they just put them in alternative schools. And I think we have to address sort of a plan of action. We're looking at the holistic approach with having to make sure that kids are getting the services in the public school. And so that's the way to do it, is that let's look at the public school, enforcing, getting special ed teachers that are qualified. We talked about not having qualified teachers. The laws are really clear. We have to have qualified teachers, and we have to have special ed teachers, and we have to. And that's the part to invest in, is to make sure that all those services are being placed to prevent those kids getting pushed into other systems.
A lot has been said about a holistic approach. We're dealing with, as chairman of the crime subcommittee, how to deal with youth violence. And there are essentially two theories. One is to wait for them to join a gang, mess up, get caught, and then get into a bidding war as to how much time they're going to serve. Or the bill I've introduced, the Youth Promise Act, which takes a holistic approach, requires a community to come together, have all the players come together that have anything to do with children at risk. That would be, of course, law enforcement, education, foster care, mental health, the Boys and Girls Clubs, faith-based community, everybody around the table to find out first what the problem is, and then what your resources are, and then what you can do about it. What the problem is, that calculation will calculate how much money you're spending on incarceration and preventable welfare. Put that number in the middle of the table as you have your discussion. That number for Los Angeles County would be about somewhere in the vicinity of $5 billion a year. In many cities of 100,000, 100 to 200,000, you'll have 20, 30, 40, $50 million a year on incarceration alone. Kind of put that number on the table, so as you discuss what your strategy is to reduce crime 50%, if you can save 20 or $30 million, you ought not limit your imagination to programs that cost $250,000. Coupled with the fact that we're spending for targeted at-risk children today in many communities $10,000 a year per child in future incarceration that you could eliminate, seems to be consistent with what you're saying. One of that approach was used, the gentleman from Pennsylvania may know, was used in Pennsylvania, where they did this approach and funded about $60 million worth of programs. And within a couple of years, they had identified over $300 million that they had saved with those investments. So it's cost-effective, it works, and it's it saves much more money than they spend. And we ought to be doing that before we start loading up on more incarceration. I mean, what kind of people are we that would not spend the $60 million, but would rather spend in a few years $300 million cleaning up the pathology and ravages of preventable crime?
And one quick thing, it was for us, just in our population, we have 60 kids we worked with in preventing foster youth from crossing from dependency into delinquency, and we also have another program which is a school to pipeline reversal project. And just alone in those projects where we're in the collaborative approach, we're able to identify not only what these individual needs, but the systemic issues. And I think as you're working in a collaborative approach, is being willing to look at those systemic issues to be able to identify wow, which school districts are having trouble getting special ed teachers, and how do we look at that as a community at large to make those changes? And so by working in the collaborative, you're actually able to address much larger scope issues. Thank you.
Ms. Platts.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As we're talking about lots of student programs, I want to reference a guest I have here today. This is my 15th year as a mentor in what's called the Future Leaders of York program for high school students, and I'm honored to have a junior from Northeastern High School in my district, Michael Chilcott, back here, participating in that program, and an example of a positive program where we're reaching out to students in a positive way. Each of you have given us great knowledge in your written testimonies and in your statements here today, and in looking at them and trying to pull out a couple of things that were highly recommended. And Dr. Whitmore and Ms. Steele, you both touched on an issue that I think is critically important, and that's school counseling, counseling services, as well as social services, and that kind of wraparound with the student and the family. I know, Ms. Neal, in your testimony, you talked about the need for more school guidance counselors, and I can openly tell you that, but for Mrs. Jewell, my 7th grade guidance counselor, I don't know if I would have made it through the 7th grade at York Suburban Junior High, let alone had the chance to go on to college and law school, actually at Pepperdine in the LA area, and know personally how important student or school guidance counselors are. You tie that into the issue of social workers, and at home, I've seen just the great benefit of this connection of schools and social work through a family member. A lot of my family are in the education field. My youngest sister has a social work background, worked in domestic relations and things over the years, and has a teaching background. And she now works for one of my local school districts, where she is in the school and connecting the school to all the social service agencies in our community, and dealing with students who have a record of truancy or other delinquency issues, and working with the parents in how to connect them to both the social agency programs and the school programs. One of the benefits she has as being part of the school system, she has some leverage under our law regarding truancy that can help engage that family, the parents, to take more responsibility and be engaged in their child's life and schooling and opportunities. But that connection seems so important, and how we can try to replicate that, that we have a more seamless, and a number of you have mentioned the importance of a seamless program of services that we're, that holistic approach, I think is how you said it, Mr. Dixon, is so important. So, that kind of best practices that you've shared is very important to us, again, as policymakers, as we look how to funnel what is always going to be limited resources. And the issue is where do we put those resources and how to get the biggest return and the cost benefit that Chairman Scott referenced, that we can be effective in intervening appropriately. I did want to, on the specific issue of parental involvement, Dr. Whitmore, you mentioned in your list of successful alternative ed programs a number of issues, one of which is the counseling and social services, including with families. And I was wondering if you could expand on what level of parental involvement you see with your students. Is there any mandatory parental involvement with your students? And then if you're able to, maybe not in an exact statement, but the connection between greater parental involvement and the outcomes that you're able to achieve with the student.
I wish we knew how to do mandatory parental involvement. We offer, our families are very much involved in all of our programs as much as we can. They come in at intake, and there's constant communications. We hold family meetings. We try to do parenting classes. We invite them to participate. I've had families that are court-ordered for family therapy because we have people trained in structured family therapy, and they still won't come. So as much as, we have a family-based mental health program that's available because we do offer a full range of mental health services also, that, we can work with a student and their family and funded through medical assistance or funded through insurance companies. So we encourage and try to do everything we can, but even when it's forced, a lot of times it doesn't even happen. But we all know that that is the breakdown of the whole scenario of this is what's going on with the child. And when the family walks in the door, you can see almost whether you're going to be successful or not going to be successful because of that family support system.
Let me give you a program that nobody really ever looks at. What we have in Wayne County, we call it an intergenerational program, where we bring in senior citizens, ex-school teachers, ex-seniors, and they are matched up with kids.
Foster.
And one of the things that I found is that they really engage those seniors. It's like those grandmothers that they never had, and they really sit down, and when we're doing our educational pieces with them, the seniors are sitting in the classroom and on the units with those kids. And I think that's a resource that we tend not to look at. And we went to Catholic services, and we feed them, we do all of those things. And they are so grateful because a lot of seniors are just sitting and not doing anything.
Mr. Dixon, you're preaching to the choir here, because the chairwoman and I are pushing reauthorization of the National Service legislation, including the foster grandparent program, which exactly what I was just at a program probably 2 months back where we honored the seniors in our community who are part of that foster grandparent, and the outcomes we see from the students, and how their benefit and the benefit to the seniors is tremendous. So you've got us on your side on that one. We clearly, in wanting to advocate and expand that opportunity to every community we can. Yep. And Dr. Cave?
I want to go to the policy level, the state policy level, and say that our governor, Timothy Kane, recommended to the Board of Education that they adopt in their school accreditation criteria that every child at 7th grade have an individual academic and career plan, every child. And that part of that development of that plan involves the family, and accountability is built in with signatures of the parents and of the school officials and of the principals. So as far as you can mandate parent participation, this is a beginning to say we're going to look at what your child needs, and we're trying to plan for their goals and their interests throughout their educational program in school. And you have to come back and you have to re-examine it at 9th grade and then before 11th grade. And each time you have to have your parent there to sign. And in our re-enrollment regs, the re-enrollment mandates that the student be a participant and the parent be present. So as much as you can put into your policies, that parent involvement and some accountability statement for that is expected, would help some.
And I know I referenced my sister's position within the public school system. What she finds is the threat of a fine that she's able to, under truancy laws, is what gives her some of the leverage of ensuring a parent participates. Ultimately, we hope they then get engaged, but that leverage she has is probably different than on the private side, in different settings. So, Ms. Steele, did you want to respond as well?
Yeah, just we also have to always keep in mind there are children that don't have parents.
Yep.
And so we always have to think about how are we going to engage them, make sure that who is responsible for them. I mean, that's a whole other committee meeting of the crisis with surrogate parents, that we have a huge crisis, and that's why a lot of foster youth are getting tracked. And also with counselors, and that will assist in that. They're having more counselors. They're the first cuts, and they're replaced with security guards and probation officers on the general school side. So, I mean, I think, getting more counselors there to really look at, larger issues, same with social workers, and looking at how if we had social workers, psychiatric social workers in LA for a while, and it was amazing. They changed some kids' lives. They turned them completely around, and they're the first to go. When the cuts hit, they're the first to go. They're considered dispensable, and I don't understand that, and so.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and I thank certainly Bobby Scott and here representing his subcommittee. We have taken in a lot of information, and I appreciate each and every one of you. If you notice that I'm usually more than generous with time on having answers. If we had the full committee here, it wouldn't happen because it would take too long. But most of us here have very inquisitive minds, and we have a lot of questions that we do like to ask. I think what I'll take away from, this hearing is that, I've lived in Mineola, I've lived in my own home for 62 years or so, and so my community still has a small school from the grade school. It still has a small middle school, and it has a small high school. And I have to tell you, the teachers know every single kid. And as you were saying earlier, though, we see our states coming under budget crunches. What are the first things to go? Basically, all the youth services programs, all the programs for our young people that need mental health. And it just goes on and on and on. And it's a shame because it goes from the youngest to the oldest. But with that being said, I'm hoping that we will be able to work on legislation to make certainly better choices and to help every child. Most of us here are great believers that you can change a child's life, giving the right services and giving the right opportunities. But there are also many of us here that feel very strongly if we get that child early enough and work with the parents, we wouldn't be dealing with some of the issues that we're dealing with. So with that, as previously ordered, members will have 14 days to submit additional materials for the hearing record. Any member who wishes to submit follow-up questions in writing to the witness should coordinate with the majority staff within the requested time. Without objection, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.